While the rest of the world was counting down to midnight, a plane was falling out of the sky over Texas. No warning, no mayday call that anyone was prepared for. Just smoke filling the cabin, passengers screaming, and a DC-3 spiraling toward the ground at terrifying speed. When the wreckage finally settled in that open field near DeKalb, Ricky Nelson was gone, 45 years old, one of the most beloved voices in American music history. Dead on the last night of the year, the official story came quickly: a faulty heater, a cabin fire, a terrible accident, move on. But something about that explanation never sat right with the people who were closest to him. Witnesses near the crash site told different versions of what they saw. Questions were raised and then quietly buried, and the people who loved Ricky most said almost nothing at all. For years, the silence was deafening, and then his mother finally spoke. What Harriet Nelson revealed in her final years didn't just add to the story, it rewrote it completely. Because the truth about Ricky Nelson, the real truth, had never been about the crash. It had been about everything that led up to it. And once you hear what she said, you'll never see Ricky Nelson the same way again. To understand how it all ended, you have to go back to where it began. Ricky Nelson didn't just become a star, he was manufactured into one before he was old enough to choose it for himself. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, were American royalty. Their television show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, ran for 14 seasons and made the Nelson family one of the most recognized households in the entire country. Every week, millions of families tuned in to watch them. The perfect parents, the perfect home, the perfect life. And right there in the middle of it all were Ricky and his brother David. Growing up on camera, performing normalcy for a nation that couldn't get enough of them. Then in 1957, something shifted everything. Ricky picked up a guitar, reportedly just to impress a girl he liked, and recorded a song on a whim. That song exploded. Almost overnight, the sweet-faced kid from the television screen became a full-blown rock and roll sensation. He had the voice, the looks, the effortless cool that made teenage girls absolutely lose their minds. Hello Mary Lou, Travelin' Man. Songs that climbed straight to the top of the charts and stayed there. He was performing on national television, selling millions of records. His face was on every magazine cover. America was completely in love with Ricky Nelson. And Harriet, she watched all of it with a pride that ran so deep it almost hurt to look at. She was his biggest supporter. Warm and steady and always present. In public, she was the picture of a devoted mother watching her son take over the world. But behind the cameras, behind the carefully curated image of the perfect American family, something else was quietly taking shape. Something no one was talking about. And what happened next changed everything. By the early 1970s, the music world had moved on without warning. The Beatles had cracked everything open. Rock and roll had become something darker, something louder, something far more complicated than the clean-cut sound that had made Ricky famous. And suddenly, the teen idol from the television show felt like a relic. He refused to give up. That was the thing about Ricky: he was never someone who walked away from a fight. He formed a new band. He shifted his sound toward country rock. He pushed himself back onto the stage and into the spotlight with everything he had left. Then came Madison Square Garden, 1971. One of the most famous venues in the world, packed with thousands of people who had come to see Ricky Nelson. But when he started playing new material, they booed him. He stood on that stage and he heard the crowd turn on him, not because he was bad, but because he had changed, because he wasn't the boy they remembered. Because they wanted the past, and he was trying desperately to live in the present. He sat backstage afterward, his expression tight, clearly trying to hold everything together. He channeled that humiliation into a song, Garden Party, a raw, defiant anthem about refusing to perform for people who only wanted a version of you that no longer existed. It became one of his biggest hits of the decade, but no hit record could cover up what was happening underneath. People close to him started noticing things. The easy, open smile that had defined him for 20 years was disappearing behind closed doors. He became withdrawn, harder to reach, more isolated. His marriage to Chris Harmon, the woman he had built his family with, the mother of his 4 children, was fracturing under the weight of distance and silence. His twin sons Gunnar and Matthew were still young. His daughter Tracy was growing up, and Ricky was slowly drifting away from all of them. Harriet saw it. She reached out as often as she could. But the reasons behind it, the full story of what her son was carrying, were something she would only allow herself to speak about years later. And no one was ready for what she would say. What the public never knew, what was carefully kept out of every interview and every press release. was that Ricky Nelson had been struggling in ways that went far deeper than a career slowdown. People in his inner circle described a man who seemed to exist between two completely different versions of himself. The polished, charming Ricky that the world expected to see and the private man who was quietly falling apart. There were stories, erratic behavior on tour, financial decisions that made no sense for someone of his stature, and a growing dependence on substances that people who loved him watched with helpless, heartbroken concern. No one said it publicly. No one wanted to be the one to destroy the image of someone that an entire generation had grown up adoring. And that's when things took a shocking turn. Because the plane crash on New Year's Eve didn't happen in a vacuum. In the weeks leading up to that flight, people who knew Ricky described a man operating under enormous, barely contained pressure. There were arguments, tensions with members of his touring band that had been building for months, and a series of choices, personal and professional, that left the people closest to him deeply unsettled. When the plane went down and the investigation began, the official findings pointed to a faulty heater in the cabin as the origin of the fire. But some witnesses near the crash site told investigators the fire appeared to start further back in the plane, nowhere near the heater. Others who had known Ricky for years refused to accept the tidy conclusion. They felt like questions were being closed before they had truly been answered. And through all of it, Harriet Nelson said almost nothing. For months, then years, the world assumed she was a grieving mother who simply couldn't bring herself to speak. And that was true, but it was only part of the truth, because the silence she was carrying was about far more than grief. The truth behind it was far more devastating than anyone realized. Harriet Nelson lived for almost 9 more years after Ricky died. 9 years of carrying something that very few people ever truly understood. Those who were close to her in her final years described a woman in quiet, constant pain, not broken, not bitter, but weighted down by something she could never fully put down. In private conversations, later shared by family friends and people who had been in her closest circle, Harriet spoke about guilt. A very specific, very devastating kind of guilt. Not the guilt of a mother who had failed her child, but the guilt of a mother who had seen warning signs she didn't know how to act on. Who had watched the pressure building for years and hadn't found the words to break through. She talked about the television show. About what it had really meant to raise children in front of the entire country. How the Nelson family had been required week after week, season after season, to perform happiness. To perform normalcy, even when the reality behind the cameras was far messier and far more human. She believed that childhood, always watched, always performing, never allowed to simply be a kid, had planted something in Ricky that he spent the rest of his life trying to outrun. She said the image of the perfect American family had become a cage, and Ricky had never fully found his way out of it. But then she revealed something that shook the people who heard it. She said that in the months before the crash, Ricky had called her, not in the usual way, not with the bright, everything-is-fine energy he had learned to perform so well. This call was different. His voice was quieter, heavier, like a man who was trying to say something important but couldn't find the opening to say it. Harriet had felt it, she had known something was wrong. But she had told herself there would be more time, that she would call him back, that the conversation would happen when the moment was right. And then New Year's Eve came, and the moment never came. She carried that missed conversation every single day for the rest of her life. That one unanswered call, that one opening she hadn't walked through, it never left her. And the people who heard her speak about it said they never forgot the look on her face when she did. The years after Ricky's death told their own painful story. His twin sons Gunnar and Matthew grew up carrying a grief that didn't come with instructions. They formed their own band, Nelson, and found real success in the early 1990s. But in interviews over the years, both brothers were honest about what that success felt like when it was wrapped around so much loss. About what it meant to inherit a legacy you never asked for. About the complicated weight of being Ricky Nelson's sons in a world that would never stop reminding them of it. His daughter Tracy built her own career, her own identity, while still carrying the family name. And the questions around the crash never fully disappeared. Years later, those who looked back at the original investigation acknowledged that the evidence had been largely destroyed by the fire itself. That the conclusions had been reached quickly, under difficult circumstances, with limited information. Some who had been present that night maintained, quietly, persistently, that the complete story of what happened on that plane had never been fully told. But what Harriet's revelations brought to the surface wasn't a conspiracy. It was something far more human than that. It was the portrait of a family that had performed perfection for the entire world while drowning in private. A son who had been placed inside an image before he was old enough to consent to it. A mother who had loved him fiercely and still felt like it hadn't been enough. And a final phone call that never got a response. Ricky Nelson's music is still everywhere. Turn on an oldies station on a long drive, and you'll hear that voice warm and easy and full of the kind of effortless cool that most people spend their whole careers chasing. He made it look natural, he always did. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, 2 years after he died. A recognition that felt to the people who loved him like it arrived just slightly too late. His children kept his memory alive, his story kept being told. But what Harriet Nelson allowed herself to say in her final years adds something to that story that no award or archive ever could. It's a reminder that the people we put on the highest pedestals are still people, still carrying things we can't see from the audience, still waiting for someone to ask the right question at the right moment. Ricky Nelson deserved more time. His mother knew that better than anyone alive. And she never stopped carrying the weight of the moments they didn't get. So I want to know what you think. Did the world ever truly see the real Ricky Nelson, the man behind the image, behind the smile, behind the music? And when Harriet finally spoke, do you think she was protecting his memory or finally allowing herself to grieve honestly? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Seriously, we read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of story that deserves a real conversation. If this moved you, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it means everything for getting stories like this one in front of more people. And if you want more untold stories about the legends Hollywood never quite told the truth about, subscribe right now. New stories drop every week. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.